Hey, action figure fans, toy makers, movie studios, dog walkers, fish collectors. Okay, maybe not fish collectors. This is Scott ToyGuru Neitlich. I've been in the toy and entertainment industry for the last 20 plus years, and I'm also a toy collector, which gives me a bit of a unique perspective on the industry of toy making and action figure collecting. That's what this channel is all about. And thanks to you guys for subscribing. We are definitely building an audience. And every once in a while I get a suggestion from an audience member, like this one here from Blue-Haired Lawyer. I don't think the actual animated character. But Blue-Haired Lawyer asked, what's the difference between movie action figures and comic book action figures, and which ones sell better? Or rather, why do movie action figures tend to sometimes sit on shelf? All right, great idea. Let's talk about it. So here's just kind of a look at movie versus comic, and we all know that a lot of times movie characters will change aesthetically, look-wise, from the comic book medium to live action. Now, we're kind of living in a golden age now where the live action tends to look more and more similar to the original comic book source material. Sometimes they get it 100% correct. Sometimes it's clearly influenced by, or you can see, like this this example of the Shocker. You can see, there's clearly an influence from the comic book version, but it's sort of real life-ized. That's not a word, but I think you know what I mean. And then other times, they'll take characters and even change races or even genders in order to diversify casts. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't, but that's also, a big trend of translating comic book characters to live action. But how about how we go from that live action to action figure? This also has a lot of challenges. So you'll see, especially today, there's a big trend of having mixed waves. That's a mix between live action figures and comic book figures. Whereas even 10 years ago or 15 years ago, this was kind of frowned upon. Other times, you'll get things like entire comic book inspired waves, but they're meant to allude to the movie. Sometimes it's for legal reasons. There's all sorts of rationale for why this happens, but you'll see this as well, where the comic book figures are referencing the movie without actually doing the movie figures. But really, the big question is, what sells better? What goes better for collectors and for kids and for the toy buying public? If you have action figures based on comic books and animation, when you have years and years of, well, really decades sometimes, of fan following for this particular look. And yes, characters do change their outfits in comic books all the time, but there are still decades worth of fans who know and recognize the comic book look of characters. Versus now we're living in this golden age of comic book movies where you can build an entire team of movie-based characters, which, again, are influenced by the comic book. So the big question is, what works better? And let's look at a couple examples. So let's start with Spider-Man. So Spider-Man has had a lot of movies over the last 20 years. In fact, he has had 3 entire relaunches of his franchise in the last 20 years, give or take. So it started with, of course, the Sam Raimi movies, and then Sony relaunched it with the Mark Webb films, and, the costume changed a little bit between each movie. It definitely was an unrecognizable Spider-Man, but there are some differences between the costume and the look of the characters. In the Sam Raimi movies, the web shooters were organic. In the Mark Webb, they were part of the costume. And then, as part of the MCU films, again, the costume is changed a little bit, but it's still very recognizable, and it's still very Spider-Man. And that kind of goes back to the source material. Looking at the comic book character of Spider-Man, he really has not changed that much in the last 50 years. He's basically the same character and same look. Looking at his very first appearance from Amazing Fantasy 15, I mean, yes, you've got the wing webs, and the blue is a little bit closer to black, but fast forward to a comic of him published just a few months ago, it's pretty much the same costume. He hasn't changed that much over the years. Another good example to look at is Batman. So in his live action, he actually changes quite a lot. Sometimes he's wearing spandex, sometimes he's wearing armor, sometimes, all sorts of things. His costume probably changes the most movie to movie, and he, Batman, has had more movies than any other superhero, meaning he's had more live action looks than any other superhero. In fact, he's about to get yet another movie look coming up. That'll be different from his previous movie looks. And the point I'm making is that there's not one definitive version the way there is more with the comic book line, like using Spider-Man, where Spider-Man has 50 years of wearing the same costume. With Batman, it's kind of the same thing. In the comic books, he really hasn't changed that much. But in the movies, he tends to get a new look with each new reimagining. And this isn't a bad thing. This is a really good thing because we like getting new versions of our characters. But this is going to feed into the concept of why is it that movie action figures sometimes don't tend to sell as well as the comic book versions that inspired them. And the Spider-Man and Batman example was sort of background. So, all right, let me dive in and see if I could bring this to an actual point. Let's look at the X-Men movies. So, the X-Men franchise, when it started in the late 90s, that was the first time. A lot of us thought this was like the only X-Men movie we were ever going to get. We got them live action. Maybe we hoped for a sequel, but the idea that we were going to get 20 years of X-Men movies in this universe, I don't think was on anyone's mind at the time. So when these figures came out, it was like, wow, live-action X-Men, this is amazing. I want to get the definitive live-action X-Men figures because we're probably never going to get this again. Now, fast forward to now, and we're looking at a major relaunch of the X-Men franchise in the MCU. So are those older Bryan Singer figures still going to be desirable if now the X-Men look different in the MCU? That's kind of part of the question and part of the answer. When you're looking at the comic book look and the timeless nature of it, no matter what happens in live action, it always exists and it sort of perseveres. Even the animated series, this was 1-to-1 to the comic books of the 90s. It was really just an animated version of the comic books, and comic books and animation are very similar. But it does play into the decades and decades of fan support and fandom of the comic book version of these characters, versus the movies constantly relaunching and changing. It's not as concrete. Let's look at an opposite example. So something like Star Wars, where the live action is actually the dominant medium for Star Wars. There are, I think, way more fans of the films than there are, say, of the comic books. I'm not saying the comic books aren't good and the comic books aren't awesome in their own, but Star Wars is sort of the opposite, where the live action really is the core of the fandom, as opposed to the movies as opposed to the comic books. So here's another really good example. Guardians of the Galaxy, the first movie. When this movie came out, it was a very large bet. Nobody kind of knew if it was going to work, and I think it surprised a lot of people, and especially the toy makers. When they started making toys, if you look at the initial wave, it had a comic book-based Iron Man at 2 per case for the original Marvel Legends wave. And looking back, this is kind of like, well, wow, you wouldn't even put Rocket, who was so huge in the movie? Well, that's because at the time, no one knew if this was going to work and this was going to translate. Now, of course, it turned out that Groot and Rocket basically became the 2 breakout stars of the film, but there was very, very little merchandise of them in the first movie. In fact, it really wasn't until the second volume, movie 2, that we started getting things like Rocket roleplay, because he'd already proven himself as a character. And this all backs up the fact that all licensed movies, meaning movies that are going to have licensed consumer products, are essentially a bet. Are you going to have a sure thing, or are you going to have a movie that doesn't perform? Guardians of the Galaxy overperformed. Nobody expected it to do so well. Versus, on the other hand, you have something like Solo, which was assumed to be a sure bet because it was a Star Wars live action, but at the end of the day, it didn't perform, especially in the consumer product category. And a lot of this is due to the timeline. Toy companies are getting the script 2 to 3 years before the movie is released. And so they have to try to guess and figure out who's going to be hot, who is going to be a breakout character. So Moloch here was assumed to be a breakout character and got a deluxe Black Series figure that is still at Target today. Versus Rocket and Groot there, nobody bet on them. Nobody, when the script was handed over, thought they were going to be the breakout characters, but they turned out to be. So it's all a betting game, and no one knows for sure who is going to work and what aspects of the script are going to translate best to consumer product. Especially when the script is going to go through so many changes between when it's handed over to the toy companies for review and the final version that winds up on screen, which is why you often wind up with toys, and I did a whole video about this, I'll put a link, that don't necessarily match up from toy to screen. So this Cull Obsidian Build-A-Figure from Marvel Legends didn't quite look like his movie counterpart. He was close, but he actually looks a lot more like the pre-Viz art, because that's what the content, or rather the reference material that was probably given to Hasbro at the time. So they built the figure not off of what he looked like in the movie, but what he looked like in his pre-Viz art. This is another example, the cutscene of Hulk busting out of the Hulk armor that didn't make it into Infinity War, went on to become quite a few toys, but this entire segment wasn't in the film. And this is all why making consumer products and making action figures based on live action movies is difficult, and why sometimes they don't necessarily sell as well as the comic book. Because when the product is being designed 2 to 3 years ahead of the movie's release, one, it doesn't always match the film, and two, comic book universes and IP are, in this day and age, constantly being reimagined in live action. There really isn't a definitive one-and-done film. So, again, the point I made earlier about the Bryan Singer movie, when these figures came out, everyone rushed to get them, thinking this was our one and only chance to get live-action X-Men movie action figures, not thinking we're going to get 20 years of this, and there's going to be all these sequels and spin-offs and, et cetera, et cetera. And then now X-Men again is being reimagined in the MCU and will probably look different. So all of these movie characters, all of these live action are essentially aimed at the fan of that one moment in pop culture, when that version of Batman, that Adam West or George Clooney or whoever it is, if you're a fan of that, that is very strong. But compared to the comic book look of character, the fan base for that is not as one and done. It goes on for decades and decades and decades, so that tends to be why comic book looks and the classic look sell often better than the movie look. The movie look is existing in a fixed vacuum, versus the comic book look is going on forever. And that brings me back to Toyetic Film Review, which is a service that I offer for studios and scriptwriters and toy companies. I have decades of experience translating movies into action figures, and I love to use this experience to help look at scripts and figure out how best to translate them into consumer product. So whether you want that service or you just want more videos, absolutely appreciate subscribing to this channel, helping us grow, and if you like what you see, we'll keep making more. Thanks for everyone's support.